welcome back. I have a very special guest today. Every one of my guests is special, but today we have Dr. Nathan Placencia, and he is a contributor as well to this delightful book that I helped co-edit, Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy. And I just want to read a little snippet from the bio in the book. Nate is an associate professor of philosophy at Los Angeles Valley College, and he works on topics in moral psychology, the philosophy of race, and the philosophy of religion. And he recently published Will There Be Races in Heaven, which I highly recommend you take a look at, and as well as other journal articles and chapters and things. So Nate, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
Well, today we just want to talk about your excellent contribution to the volume, in which you tackle the question of whether or not there will be race in the afterlife, and you do it from an Eastern Christian perspective. So before we get into that theological kind of question, let's start by talking about the philosophy of race, because in your chapter you draw heavily on recent work in the philosophy of race. I think many people watching this video may be unfamiliar that that's actually an entire subdiscipline of philosophy, and then have questions about, well, what is it? What do you study? What is the philosophy of race? So could you please begin by explaining what the philosophy of race is and how you got interested in studying it?
Sure. Well, yeah, like any philosophical discipline, to call it the philosophy of race, it's philosophical reflection on race, right? So there's a lot of questions surrounding that particular topic, and philosophers have kind of made their contribution to the conversation that's happening in the academic world beyond philosophy. And so that's one general way to talk about the philosophy of race, right? But more specifically, I think one of the kind of questions that philosophers have focused on, and where we make our contribution, and I guess this is kind of typical of philosophy, we make it on the kind of theoretical side of what kind of accounts could you give of what race is. And so there's a lot of the work in the philosophy of race is developing models for understanding what race is, but also in a kind of critique of some of the concepts of race that have been on offer since the 1800s. And so there's kind of two sides to it. There's this critical component where you're going after old concepts that make no sense, and then there's a more kind of constructive part of the philosophy of race where you're trying to articulate concepts of race that make sense, that make philosophical sense. There's some people doing empirical research too. I don't do much of that. They're doing experimental philosophy in the philosophy of race. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but anyways, that's kind of what it does. Now, I got interested into this field sometime during my graduate work. I was working on topics in agency, and I had these questions about how kind of our location in the social world, how it plays into our agency, right? And it wasn't talked about as much back when I was in grad school. So if you're thinking about how we fit into the social world, a lot of the work in social ontology and social metaphysics is connected to, or kind of, you find the philosophy of race while you're doing that kind of work. And that's where the initial interest kind of came out of that interaction in my research in grad school. And I just kept kind of working on it since then.
Yeah. No, I'm the same. There are things that I encountered while working on my dissertation that kind of got me off in a direction I never expected when I started. So that's really interesting. Thank you for that kind of brief introduction to the field. So you mentioned that then part of philosophy of race is not only constructing maybe theories about what race is, but also critiquing some of the accounts that have been given. There's one account that you begin by considering in your chapter called the racialist account.
Right.
Could you maybe explain what the racialist conception of race is and why it's so problematic?
Yeah, so the racialist concept is probably the account of race that people are familiar with and that they reject, right? If they thought about it a little bit. But it's important to kind of articulate what it is so that you can be clear about the problem and not make the same mistake. So anyways, the racialist concept, it's given this kind of special designation as the racialist concept, so it can be easily distinguished from other concepts. And that's one reason why this term racialist has been used to designate this one in particular. But basically, this is a kind of concept of race that tries to find these subgroups within the human species, right? So you have at this lower taxonomic level an attempt to sort out the human species into these other categories that fall along what people thought were natural divisions of the human species. All right, so that's where the racialist starts. And they kind of think that these subgroups are discrete. They're not, if you can kind of easily draw lines to where one group starts and another group begins. They argued that each member of a race has a set of fixed traits. These traits, the traits that we associate with race, are oftentimes linked to visible traits, right? So skin color, hair texture, body structure are oftentimes linked to these subgroups. Well, in the racialist theory, they are linked to the subgroups. They're not, it's not oftentimes, that's just the way the racialist theory works. So every subgroup has a set of traits, visible traits. And in addition to those visible traits, the racialist includes a list of non-visible traits like moral traits, intellectual traits, behavioral traits, social and cultural traits. They all get kind of lumped together, and there's this correlation between the visible traits on the one hand and the not visible traits, or the less visible traits, the moral, the intellectual, the behavioral traits. And so both of these traits are supposed to come from some underlying biological structure. They don't really talk much about what that biological structure is. I guess later racialists might be able to kind of pull from the kind of pseudoscience surrounding genetics and DNA. Not that, right? There's a way to kind of interpret that data about the human DNA to make it kind of simplistic and fit the racialist paradigm. But anyways, that's not what they did initially. They just thought there was some biology behind it that explained where the traits come from. And if they didn't have, sometimes they use the language of bloodlines and things like that to kind of indicate what they're pointing at, some biological structure beneath that causes the traits to arise within the groups. And so this is a kind of a biological essence, as it were, that determines that whether you're in one group or another. So these groups are then sometimes, or not sometimes, in the racialist way of thinking, they're ranked, right? They're ranked in a kind of hierarchy of better and worse races. They're usually ranked along a number of different dimensions. So like you might think like this race is more apt to be morally responsible, and this one is more apt not to. This one is better at intellectual tasks, and this one isn't. And so you kind of make the system, a ranking system of the different races. And pretty early on, that ranking system gets used as a way to rationalize the colonization of different lands, and it gets used to rationalize the oppression of different groups. It gets used to rationalize the institution of slavery. And so it has these pretty terrible consequences. It's one of these ideas in human history that was a really bad idea, but not all bad ideas turn out to be terrible for us in the long run. Some bad ideas just kind of go away. This bad idea stuck around, and it had this kind of long, it has put a long kind of set of problems that we've been dealing with since the time the idea was kind of articulated. Well, there's one more thing about the racialist concept that I should have mentioned, is that the racialist concept says that these traits are inherited from one generation to the next, right? So if you are born into one of these races, you're kind of stuck with the traits that determine the race. And so it not only locates one generation of people within this kind of hierarchy or ranking system, it locates descendants of these groups. Now, I will say, I just want to make it very clear that there's one consensus in the philosophy of race, and that is that this is wrong, right? That this way of thinking about race is, whoever's looked at it, whether it's geneticists, contemporary anthropologists, contemporary philosophers, everyone's looked at this, and it's clear that this is wrong-headed, right? That this is not, there's nothing in the world that looks like racialist races. So that's a racialist race, and that's where the paper started, just to make sure that everyone was clear that that's not the view of race that on offer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's not your view. And the reason why we're talking about it now, so everyone understands, in the book, to set up the discussion he's going to have about whether there's race in the afterlife, he's got to first talk about these major theories of race. We have to understand what we mean by race before we can consider the question of whether there's race in the afterlife. So that's why he goes through that. That's why we're talking about that now. I think that's really significant, what you said, that you have, it's very rare in academia that you have a large, wide consensus on something. So
Right.
the fact that everyone's like, that's wrong, that's really interesting. All right, so there's a couple of other views that you talk about in the book. And one of them is called the social race theory, the other, the minimalist account of race. And could you tell us a little bit about these theories? And I think obviously you are going to focus on the minimalist account. That's the one that you went to, but yeah, tell us a little bit about these two as well.
Yeah, so one thing I should say, I'm following Hardiman's articulation of this. So Michael Hardiman has a great article called 4 Ways of Thinking About Race. It's a more recent article, but if you go look for it. And so I'm following his articulation of these different concepts. And so he actually comes up with the term social race to distinguish it from other concepts of race. And so the social race account is that there's, as I said, there's a consensus that the racialist account is wrong. But when you look at the social world, there's still this feature of it that one might call race, right? And it's not that it's built into anyone's biology. It's that there's patterns of behavior and patterns of treatment, patterns of social patterns of interaction between people within communities that create this reality, right? And so this is oftentimes called a kind of social constructionist view of what race is. And so basically what goes on in the social constructionist concept of race is that you have certain beliefs in a society. And one of those beliefs is that this group over there is a member of a racialist race, or this person over there is a member of a racialist race. And that group is a racialist race. So you have beliefs that about different groups. And those beliefs, if they're just beliefs, then they're just false beliefs, and you can kind of move on. But that's not how this works. These false beliefs lead to behaviors, lead to action, lead to the way we treat each other. And so it's not just that there's false beliefs about people, it's that those beliefs actually factor in to the way we treat that group. We treat them oftentimes, not we, but you'll find these patterns like in the Jim Crow era, where people are treated as if they're members of racialist races. And because they're treated that way, there's a whole bunch of social consequences for their life, for the life of their children, and for those who are kind of to benefit from these patterns of treatment. And so you might not think, I mean, this is something that's hard to get used to, I think, in the philosophy of race and in social ontology and social metaphysics in general. It takes a lot, I think, to motivate that that's a real, I'm talking about something real, not just an illusion of some type that's out there in the world. But the social race theorist says that there's a social kind that's created when these patterns of treatment are maintained over time. And that social kind can be used to kind of understand the problems in society and the behaviors of people, and this is no longer a biological fact about these groups. It's an artifact of the social world, right? There's a lot more to say about that. This gets a little complicated, but I'm going to stop it there in case you have any questions, and I'll see if I can answer those.
No, I just find that really fascinating. Yeah, no, I could see maybe someone, if I'm understanding you correctly, they might be tempted to mistakenly think that this is some kind of subjective feature of the world and not something objective in there. And you're trying to make it clear that these social features are out there. Like the theorist who puts forth this view isn't saying that it's just something in your head, but it's actually okay. No, that makes sense. Okay, so
just as real as like other social facts, like social facts about money, social facts about inflation, social facts. There's social facts, there's objective facts about the world that arise through social patterns that are the result of beliefs and actions. And those things are real. They're real in different ways, right? They're contingent. They're contingently real. They're contingent upon a certain social world. So anyways.
Yeah. Well, so okay, so then obviously this isn't the view that you hold. So I guess to set up talking about the minimalist conception, like, so where do you kind of think this theory goes wrong, or what are your problems with it?
Yeah, so I didn't mean to, in the paper, maybe I made this, I didn't make this clearer, but I didn't mean to actually say I think the social race theory is wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't actually mean to say that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misread.
So that's okay. I probably said something that made it sound like I think it's wrong. I think that it's if the social race theorist is right, there won't be racism in the afterlife. So that's one thing I did say, which might lead one to think that I think it's wrong. So I tend to be my kind of current position on this, and this is Hardiman's position, and a few other people take this view as well. I'm a pluralist about the concepts of race we use. So I think the word race in the English language is ambiguous. That there's a lot of different uses of the word race, and each of the kind of the theories that I've gone over here, besides the racialist theory of race, capture one of the meanings that bring out something that I think is true about the way race language is used in the world, right? So I think there's context in which the best way to talk about race is to talk about it in the social constructionist sense. I think there's context where that's the best way to do it. I think there's context where the best way to think about race is as a minimalist, in the minimalist sense.
Okay.
So it depends on the context that and the questions you have, and the kind of data in front of you, that you might change, you might go from race 1 to race 2 because there's different meanings here. And that's one thing that Hardiman does. He says, look, I'm going to articulate this as social race. He gives it a new name because he's saying, look, this is not race. You can think about it as social race. You can think about it as minimalist race. And so he gives us new terms to help us sort this out. Anyways, so that's that. Now, I think there are criticisms of the social constructionist view of race. And one recent one is that if you kind of use this as a way to help you do social research, right? If you're trying to find social patterns, it doesn't work as well as we'd want it to, right? If it's actually going to be used as a way to identify something real in the world, when we actually use it to quantify certain kinds of behavioral patterns, it doesn't work like it ought to work. And so there's a reason that counts against it. Anyways, there's a lot of other things there too. It takes a little while to to flesh it all out. I don't know if we want to go down that road yet.
No, fair enough. Because yeah, I mean, I'm sure we could dedicate just an entire talk just to one of these theories and really, delve deep. Okay, that's really interesting. I like the idea of pluralism too, and I myself find myself always attracted to the pluralist theories, whatever we're talking about, because there's, I tend to spend more time thinking about metaphysics and epistemology and things like that, and but I'm always like, yeah, it
Yeah,
makes
I
sense.
know. That's why, I mean, initially when I first started doing this, I like had a team, right? And I thought that, this Hardiman got it right. And then as time goes on, I'm realizing that yeah, I don't know if there's one kind of there's some theories that I think make sense of race, the phenomena of surrounding race, but I don't know if one kind of does the best job of explaining all the phenomena.
Yeah. All right then. So let's talk about the minimalist account then of race, because this one becomes important with talking about race in the afterlife. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. So how does this one differ then from the social race theory?
Yeah, so this one's different because it does point to some biological facts about people groups, right? That seem to indicate that there's enough there in terms of traits, visible traits, that you can sort people into different groups. But I want to make something clear about the minimalist view. The minimalist view doesn't ever get to anything like the racialist view, right? So I'll start talking about biology again, but it's not getting close to anything like what we found in the racialist view. So I just want to make that disclaimer so that I think when you start to hear it, you're like, wait a minute, that sounds like the racialist. I'll try to make it clear where it's not. All right, so it acknowledges that there's something like races, or let me start over. So Hardiman, this is his view. He says that if you kind of take the most simple kind of conceptual core of what people mean when they use the word race, he thinks that what we're using the word for is to indicate three things. We are using the word to indicate how some visible traits people have are connected to geographic regions of the world, and whether or not those people live in that geographic region of the world, they have ancestors that connect them back to those regions, right? And so he thinks that it's in its most basic form, that's what race language is trying to do. It's trying to sort people out based upon visible physical traits that are associated with different parts, different geographic locations. All right, so he thinks that that it has these three components, right? Visible physical features, linked to a common ancestry, linked to a geographic region of the world. And that's all, right? There's nothing else about biological essences. There's nothing more about a set of non-visible traits that are associated with each group. There's nothing about how every person within the human species can be sorted into one of these groups. And Hardiman also allows for what he calls fuzzy boundaries, that you're not going to have clean, discrete ways of dividing up the groups. But for all that, there's going to be some people that when you're kind of using this concept of race, you'll say, well, that person has these visible traits that come from this region of the world, right? And that's, for Hardiman, fairly unimportant information. He thinks that he says this in his work, that while that's what the minimalist race view is, it's not clear what kind of special information we're getting about people when we know that about them. All we're doing is saying, okay, well, those traits are associated with that region of the world, right? And so that's the minimalist view. That's the basics of the minimalist view. Yeah, so he thinks he does have a story to tell about the origin of these visible characteristics. There's a story about human migration patterns and endogamy and exogamy and all these other things that give you an account of why these traits occur within different groups and why they stick around over time. But that's not kind of central to the view. It's just a way to explain why or how it came to be that we have these different visible traits.
Yeah, now that we're discussing this, I do understand what you're saying, how there's a certain context when that social theory might be more helpful to talk
Yeah.
about when talking about race, because the minimalist view is just kind of a basic, almost like statement of the fact that, yeah, like people are spread out all over the world and people move around and there's a history there. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So that's why Hardiman says, look, if you're going to trace the kind of current problems with structural racism or the current problems we face, right, in our society surrounding race, the social race view does a better job of pointing to the problems. Minimalist race is just pointing to a kind of fact about certain people groups that is oftentimes it's oftentimes kind of what is used as a proxy for, or used as the supposed facts that build the social race, right? So anyways.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Well, not to dwell too long on that, because I know we have other important things to talk about, although I think we could do a lot more to talk about that, because that's really fascinating. Even the interplay between a minimalist account and the social race theory, and how that plays into all of the discussions we're having as a society and all the problems we're facing. I feel like that could be an entire episode just dealing with that. But I'm gonna resist going down that rabbit hole right now. So all of this discussion we've had, so everyone listening and watching, this is all setting up the kind of the main discussion, which is a kind of a theological / philosophical discussion about the afterlife. So maybe you've never thought of this before, but those listening, have you ever asked yourself, well, what is the afterlife like, especially from a Christian point of view? We have this concept of the resurrection. And so that brings up the question, like, will there be races in heaven after the resurrection? So that's the focus of your chapter. And of course, coming at it from a distinctively Orthodox of Eastern approach to answering that question. So because you're taking this from an Orthodox perspective, you focus on an important Orthodox theologian, St. Theodore the Studite. So many people may not know who this person is. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about St. Theodore and then also his theology of embodiment, which is really important for what you have to say.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of context here. There's in the other paper I wrote on will there be races in heaven, I was kind of doing a more general question about how a Christian that's just kind of using the basics of what Christians agree on could answer that question, right? So whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or East Orthodox or whatever. But that paper got only so far because I got to a certain point where it's clear that all Christians share the view that we'll be psychologically continuous. Like whoever's in the afterlife that's Nathan will be psychologically continuous with Nathan. Right. So that much I think is kind of clear. But what else we can say about the afterlife is really difficult to find anything that tells us anything more about what the afterlife might be like. And what you find in kind of the scriptural tradition is not determinative either. So you have stories of Christ resurrecting and his body and what his body's like. It seemed kind of hard to figure out what's going on there. And so you have this case where the disciples don't recognize Christ on the road to Emmaus. And so you might think, well, the body must be really different in the afterlife. So I was looking for someone who said something about what bodies are like in the afterlife. And so, anyways, Saint Theodore the Studite, he didn't have this question exactly in mind when he was writing about the body. What he had in mind was the controversy surrounding iconoclasm versus the iconoduals or iconophiles. And the iconoclasts, one of their arguments was that, look, Christ is resurrected, Christ is with the Father, that you can't depict him anymore, right? Because in their minds, the resurrected state, whatever it's like, it's bodily in some sense, but whatever it is, it's not anything you could depict, right? It's nothing you could actually paint. So, and so into that conversation, Theodore starts to give his reasons why he thinks that not only did Christ have a particular body in his while he lived before the resurrection, but Christ has a particular body after the resurrection as well that's continuous with the body that he had prior to the resurrection. And so Theodore's central claim is that being human necessitates embodiment, and not just embodiment to any body, but a specific body, and that your body is unique to you. It's the body that grew in your mother's womb, just like Christ's body is the body that grew him in the womb of the Theotokos, right? That's specific to Christ, and so because of that, because we all have a human body that's unique to us, Christ can be depicted, of course, and the saints can be depicted. And he thinks that this is a reflection of the Chalcedonian Christology, in which Christ is fully human and fully God, right? That to be fully human means, I don't know if there's any way any other way to be human, and this is Theodore's point. There's just not another way to be human than to have a particular body that looks a particular way, that has a particular height, that has a particular hue, that has particular eyes, right? And Theodore is so kind of caught up in this description of the particularity of Christ's body that he actually begins to go on about the particular eyelids of Christ, right? That he has unique eyelids, right? And so those things that can be depicted when you paint an icon. All right, so he thinks that this is affirming the Chalcedonian Christology, and that it's clear that the iconoclasts are wrong about their view of Christ. But there's still some more questions to answer here, because you don't want to just make claims about Christ pre-resurrection, right? That's not the only thing the iconoclasts are arguing against. There's also questions about Christ post-resurrection, right? And so I'll take one step back here, because a lot of what I'm doing in this section of the paper is using a lot of Father Alexis Torrance's work on Theodore the Studite. So I just want to give credit to Father Alexis for giving me some of these insights. But he says that if Christ's body is resurrected, it has to be the body that the particular body that grew in the womb of Mary. What other body is there? Right? If Christ is redeeming humanity, if Christ is as fully human person, then it has to be that body that he assumed, right? Or that body that he was. And so whatever Christ's body is like after the resurrection, it's continuous with the body he had prior to the resurrection. And that body, for it to be continuous, for it to be the same body, it has to have the same individuating characteristics, right? And part of what I'll say it right, individuates characteristics is the way bodies look, right? The structure of the body.
Yeah.
And so Theodore says if the post-resurrected Christ is the same Christ that died and suffered under Pontius Pilate and all that, the Christ that resurrects has to have a body that looks the same. And if it looks the same, you can depict that body too, right?
And actually, the icons, like one of the most famous icons of the resurrection, where you have Christ almost like bursting forth from the ground, from the tomb, pulling people from out of the tomb. I mean, Christ is depicted in a way that it's obvious it matches other depiction of Christ, like the back.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, you have this continuity
iconography.
in the depiction of Christ. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so there's a quote from Father Alexis here. He says, "There's a continuous refusal in Theodore to allow any sense in which Christ escaped from his humanity, whether in terms of possessing the whole integrity of human nature in himself or possessing his particular individuating or hypostatic characteristics right through his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension." Right? So those particular individuating properties of Christ, which would include the way his body looks, those stay the same for Theodore right through his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension. Yeah, so that's Theodore's view. There's some questions that arise about how this squares with the gospel narratives, right? Because why didn't the disciples recognize Christ if Christ looks the same, right? And so you have to go back to those passages, and I don't know if Theodore does this directly, but he says a few things about this. He says one thing is that the kind of discontinuity we kind of read into the text after the resurrection and before the resurrection, the discontinuity of Christ's body is overstated. That Christ pre-resurrection can walk on water, right? Christ post-resurrection can walk through walls. There's not as much discontinuity as we think when we hear these different stories. And so Theodore makes the case that there's more continuity, or there's reasons to think that there's continuity and not discontinuity. But on the road to Emmaus, in that passage, it looks like when you kind of read it again, that the Spirit, there's a kind of blindness that's happening in the disciples, right? They can't see Christ. And it's not that that Christ is different, it's that there's something in the apostles that needs to change. And it's in the Eucharistic moment when Christ breaks bread with them that their eyes are opened and they can see Christ in front of them. So then there's other passages to point to when Paul talks about all the witnesses, the 500 witnesses of Christ. There's no mention that Christ didn't look the same in those accounts of everyone witnessing the resurrected Christ.
Right.
And I assume Paul he saw the resurrected Christ, and anyways, I think that Paul saw Christ. He knew Christ before, and he saw Christ after. So I think that this view actually does a better job of explaining some of these post-resurrection encounters.
Yeah. No, and actually, if you think of it, even if you want to take a view that, yeah, there is something different. I mean, this is whatever you want to call it, a spiritual body, something that's deified. Yeah, it's not the same as our bodies now. However you want to describe that, there's still enough continuity there that there is a moment when people do recognize him. So like, it's not like they never recognized that was Christ.
Right. Right.
So the moment they recognize it, there's something. And that, so even, if you want to kind of argue that it's still, I think that St. Theodore's view would hold up against that kind of.
I think that's right. I think that there's, so the continuity, it's going to have, there's obviously discontinuities as well, right? There's going to be a lot of discontinuities between the a pre and post resurrected body, but for Theodore, it's not, whatever those discontinuities are, it's not about the way Christ looks, right? It's, there's other discontinuities. Discontinuities.
So, okay, so let's tie this in then to the minimalist account of race.
Yeah.
I feel like our viewers probably already a light bulb's gone off and you can see the connection, but maybe just kind of like make that explicit. Like, let us know. So how does this the theology of embodiment that you're talking about with St. Theodore connect with the minimalist account of race that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so since the minimalist race, the minimalist account of race is, it's a fairly thin notion of race. So you don't have to do much to be a member of a minimalist race. There's not, it's right. Anyways, so there's not like a high bar here for traits to indicate geographic regions of the world. And so in the paper, I argue that if Christ's body remains the same in the post-resurrected state, and you have this view of minimalist race where visual traits, ancestry, linked to geographic regions is what races are, then Christ is a member of a minimalist race. Christ is a member of, I guess, I say Judean. I think there's some evidence to suggest that you can make the account of minimalist race work with that designation. There's some evidence that Judeans looked different than other people groups in the region. The evidence we have comes from the Egyptians keeping track of who the Judeans were so that they can get their money back. So they have these trade agreements where they have to describe the person, and so we have some sense of what Judeans look like, and also there's some other evidence based upon how populations have moved and the populations that were probably linked to the people groups of the Second Temple era that have been in isolation in other places within the Middle East, and people who do genetic archaeology think that those groups probably their visual traits best represent what people of the Second Temple era in Judea look like.
Wow, well, that's really fascinating. Yeah, and kind of like you said, this almost is like obvious if you accept what St. Theodore's arguing.
Yeah, that's right.
It kind of goes like without saying that Christ, obviously he's born somewhere into a particular group of people in a historic place, So, all right. So, that, then would follow from this, that yes, in the afterlife, if you accept this Orthodox Christian account of, first of all, that there is a resurrection, and like Christ, we share in that resurrection, and then you accept this account of embodiment, that there's a continuity between our resurrected body and our body now, both physical and psychological. All this is going to fall into place. So yes, then so there's going to be race in the afterlife, because obviously we're going to have characteristics that connect us to who we are now. Yeah. So okay.
So I think that's right. You got that's the way the argument goes. Well, I keep on going. You're gonna ask me a question, I think.
Oh, no, that's fine. If you had something else to say, go for it.
I think I was probably anticipating where question's going. So no, what I wanted to say, I know. So this, if Christ is like the first fruits of the resurrection, and what we say about Christ's post-resurrected body, we can say about our resurrected body to some degree, then we'll be members. So some of us, at least, will be members of minimalist races in the afterlife too, right? So the claim is not just that Christ will be, it's that all people, not all, but given the minimalist view, whereas some people can't be sorted into one of these races, and there's fuzzy boundaries between racial groups, that there'll be some people who are members of minimalist races in the afterlife.
Gotcha. Yeah. Right. So some people might be listening thinking, well, that's cool. Like, awesome, really
Yeah,
interesting medical stuff, but
yeah,
but why does it matter? Or
yeah,
does this have anything helpful to say about like right now? So I like how you end your chapter the way you did, because you do kind of actually I think that it merits like another chapter to develop this even more. But yeah, you ended on maybe talking about why holding this view that there would be a minimalist race in the afterlife um, might be really important right now for discussions. You talk about you connect this to this problem of racial homogeneity, and
yeah,
then so maybe if you could say a bit about that problem, and then maybe how this
yeah,
this theology that we've outlined, how it could actually be helpful for
yeah,
addressing
yeah.
problems.
So I think there's like one view of how to achieve racial harmony. That's something like we have to eliminate racial categories, and then be colorblind, right?
Mm,
So it's one view of the best approach to kind of achieving racial harmony. And there's places in the world where this is the model, right? So places in Europe. I was just talking to a scholar in Germany where just using the word race at all is taboo.
mm, really
And it's also true in France. Using the word race at all is taboo. And so this younger scholar was nervous about his talk because he had used the word race a lot. Um, so
interesting. I didn't
yeah,
know that.
yeah. So there's this kind of official position within places like France that the model they're trying to kind of develop is a colorblind model, right? That the way to kind of move forward here is to eliminate racial categories and to try not to pay attention to visible physical differences.
Mm,
And so I think that there's some problems with that. I don't have like a full-fledged criticism of that approach in the paper, but I do worry about some things when that approach is taken. One worry that I have is that when you kind of imagine a world without races, um, I think one fear that Black and brown people have is that that world you're imagining is just being white, right? You've
yeah.
normalized one race over the others, and so that's one fear of homogeneity. That if you achieve homogeneity, you've really kind of eliminated the racial groups that were oppressed in some way.
Mm,
You've eliminated their identity, eliminated their sense of belonging to that group,
mm,
and maybe their sense of pride. And anyway, so you eliminate those things, and that seems to be a kind of injustice, right? That these people would have to suffer through decades of oppression, centuries of oppression, and then when you achieve racial harmony, you're like, okay, you don't exist anymore, right?
mm,
So that's one problem I have, and I had this worry, and then I was reading different authors that describe heaven, and I found this kind of quote from Ellen White. I guess the pun is intended here. Let me find it real fast. Yeah, so Ellen White, she's the one of the founders of Seventh-day Adventism,
mhm.
and really well-known preacher in her, I guess I'm trying to think of what period in American history, but post-Civil War. She says this. She says she's trying to comfort the Black members of her congregation when she says this. She
Mm,
says, remembering this, you'll be able to bear the trials which you meet here. In heaven, there'll be no color line, right? The color line will be gone. That's good news. For all will be as white as Christ himself. Let us thank God that we can be members of the royal family, right? So that's articulating the worry that homogeneity is really just a way to describe whiteness, right? Uh,
right.
so so that's the worry, I think, that this kind of view of a colorblind world where racial categories are eliminated. Now, I'm not sure. I think that if you had that view, there's ways you can articulate it that don't lead to that result. But it is a worry that you'd have to kind of solve if you had that view. So I also, in the other paper, I point out that it's hard to imagine how racial harmony is achieved without race, people who are members of the race there. Right. So if you're going to achieve racial harmony, you need people who at least, I guess, remember being, you need at least something like that. And it's not just kind of water under the bridge kind of racial harmony. It's where I'm imagining the racial harmony of the resurrection to be like fully reconciled and forgiven, right? People who achieve harmony through forgiveness and reconciliation. And it seems to me that for forgiveness to happen, you're going to have people with those identities still. You have to have the members of the people that were wrong say sorry, or not say sorry, but accept the sorry, accept forgiveness, and
Right.
offer accept the apology and offer forgiveness. Right. So you're gonna have something like that. And so it looks like races will be required for racial harmony. And also, so then I was kind of,
you can't have a harmony. By definition, harmony implies there's differences.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You can't have harmony without the differences.
That's right.
It's not a harmony. Right. So that's a real problem if you're trying to say there's just no difference at all, or just ignore the difference.
Yeah.
Pretend it's not there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so then I was thinking about this passage in the 7th chapter of St. John's Apocalypse, in the book of Revelation. He says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, crying out in a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.' And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne, worship God, saying, 'Amen, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might to be to our God forever and ever. Amen.'" A beautiful scene, right? Of the gathered church worshiping God. So I think about that passage a little bit, and what occurred to me is that John in his visions looking out on this gathering, and he notices that there are people from all tribes, right, and languages, and he has this vision of all these people gathered from all parts of the world, but they're all wearing white robes. And so what is telling him that he's seeing a crowd of people from all parts of the world, right? What is he seeing? And it must be, I think the answer is that he's seeing the visible physical differences of the people gathered, right? He's seeing that there's people with different visible traits that are linked to different geographic regions of the world, and they're all together worshiping Christ.
Yeah.
And so the vision of heaven given by John, at least, is a kind of, it's not a homogeneous picture, right? It's a picture where the peoples of the world that look different are gathered together. So I think that, yeah. And then there was one more thought I had, was that if for some reason, I thought about this for myself, and I think everyone should kind of like think about this a little bit. If for some reason that image is like makes you uncomfortable, like, or it'd be better, or you'd be better off if we just didn't have these visible differences. You might ask why. Like, what is it, and why does that make us uncomfortable to think? Why are we kind of pushed in the direction of homogeneity, visible traits is going to lead, or is what we really want in this harmonious state? I think that it's telling that we, anyways, it's something to think about. I don't really want to say much more.
Yeah, no, I like that. because it kind of that is something to challenge us
Yeah.
now. So if you can't conceive of any way of overcoming, racial problems that we have, if the only way you can conceive of doing that is just by saying, oh no, there is no such thing as race, and there's no differences,
Yeah.
if that's your only way, then you're missing this beautiful picture that we actually see in the scriptures and what you're describing in this theology of embodiment and this minimalist account of race, like this picture of a true harmony.
A true harmony. Yeah.
You actually have real differences in people, but despite those differences, you're united, you're one. And it's like limiting your imagination, I guess, your way of picturing a world in which you actually still maintain those real differences, but yet finding a way to have that harmony, that unity.
Yeah.
I love that. I thought that was just a great way to end the discussion. And really also just bring it home and say, like, this is an important thing to think about, because it's not just like fun theological speculation.
Right.
It is fun, but if you're a nerdy academic like you and I, but it's also important, like it has significance to how we're living now. And
definitely. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I like studying this, is because there's this part of it that I can do that's the nerdy part, and then there's this part of it that matters that has these implications for what we're doing now. So yeah, I agree.
I'm sure this happens. I mean, I'm always with like my intro to philosophy students, I'm like trying to find a way to show how, hey, what we're talking about actually does matter.
Yeah.
It's not just pie in the sky kind of stuff. So
and for Christians, we have this kind of vision of our life, or Orthodox in particular, our life together as being a reflection of heaven, right? Of the resurrection, or being the inbreaking of heaven into our world. And so we have this close connection. Our theology, how we imagine heaven, does a lot to shape how we act as a church, and worship as a church, things like that. So yeah, I think for the Orthodox, it's it might hold like, well, maybe I don't want to say, I sometimes I don't like saying for the Orthodox we have this special thing. I like to, but in this case, I think there's like, it's clear that in Orthodox theology, that's the way we think of worship, and it's inbreaking of heaven, and if it's heaven on earth, then we ought to really pay attention to what we imagine heaven to be like.
Absolutely. Well, Nate, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion and for talking about your paper. And I encourage anyone that's viewing this to go and read the chapter for yourself, read anything else that Nate's written. And I'm sure, if you have questions, he's probably easy to find. He's got his faculty page. You can find his email address and things like that. So I'm sure he wouldn't mind answering questions and things like that. So thank you, Nate, for joining me today.
No problem. Thanks a lot for having me on.